Welcome to Casio Chaos Theory, and welcome to part 2 of this two-part video where we are comparing a selection of tones from the very first Casiotone model, the CT-201 from 1980, with one of the modern-day equivalents from 40 years later, the CT-S300. In part 1, I gave a brief introduction to both these models along with a little bit of their history. And then I got sent to this weird galaxy in a parallel universe by the supreme gods of Casio. This place is weird. I still don't know how I'm going to get back to the present, or future, or past. That's the problem with these time-bending galaxies. You just don't know where you are. Anyway, if you haven't yet seen part 1 of this two-part video, feel free to check it out. I'll put a link down below in the description box. And if you have already seen part 1 and want to see part 2, then continue watching as we compare the second half of the selected tones from this granddaddy of Casiotones, the CT-201, with its modern-day descendant, the CT-S300, from 4 decades later. CT-201 tone 14. This is Harpsichord 2. With the CT-S300, tone 273 is a GM harpsichord. The CT-201's harpsichord sound, I'm not 100% sure if it's even working properly because it's very quiet compared with some of the other tones. It's okay. It lacks that kind of pluck or twang that you get with a real harpsichord. And it's usable, but it doesn't really quite sound like a harpsichord. It's sort of getting in that ballpark. Meanwhile, the CT-S300 does a very good job of sounding like a harpsichord. It does exactly what it says on the tin, which is a GM harpsichord. Hi, I'm from the future. Well, if you are watching this video, I'm actually from the past, but I'm from the future compared with the part you just watched, where we examined the harpsichord tones from the CT-201 and the CT-S300. I need to change my assessment of the CT-201's harpsichord tone because I reached my initial verdict after hearing it as I was recording the video. As mentioned, the CT-201 harpsichord was very quiet, and I didn't want to adjust its volume knob as it's very temperamental and tends to only work in one position without cutting out. Therefore, I didn't really hear the CT-201 harpsichord tone very well to judge it fairly. During the editing of this video, I raised the volume of the CT-201 harpsichord recording to try and level match it with the CT-S300 audio. In doing so, the tone sounded considerably better, and I now want to rate it more highly than I did previously. In common with a lot of the CT201 tones, it isn't really convincing as a real harpsichord, but it's not too far away, and it also has that lovely vintage Casiotone feel about it. With the volume raised, the CT201's harpsichord is actually a very nice sound. You could get away with using it as a vintage approximation of a harpsichord, and you can certainly use it as a sound in its own right. Why it is so much quieter than some of the other CT201 tones, I don't know, but maybe that's just the way it is. Anyway, I need to get back to the future. Or is it back to the present? I don't know, these parallel universes are just too complicated. Anyway, I'll see you at the end of the video. Bye! Tone 16 in the CT201 is organ 2, and the CT-S300 we have tone 48, electric organ 2. They're not really that similar, but I couldn't find anything that sounded close to each other. Let's have a listen anyway. The CT201, that's a nice organ sound. It's not similar to the organ sound I had on the CT-S300 here. I couldn't find one that did sound similar, but it's very rich and thick and warm. I do like it. Meanwhile, the CT-S300 is definitely that nice sort of 60s, even 70s electric organ sound. Does a very good job of reproducing that. And they're both usable, but they're not very similar to each other. Number 18 in the CT201 is a trumpet. With the CT-S300, its tone 121 is the trumpet. The CT201 does not a bad job of being a trumpet. It's kind of, especially when you play more than one note. Almost mariachi sound there. The CT-S300 is much more realistic. So very... Oops, turn the sustain off. Definitely sounds like a trumpet there. And as always, the CT201 has its own sound. So it sort of sounds like a trumpet, still very, very usable, but not a realistic trumpet. Whereas if you want realism, CT-S300 will give you that. Tone 19 in the CT201 is pipe organ 1. And with the CT-S300, tone 56 is church organ 1. This is one of the really nice sounds. To me, the organ sounds, especially this pipe organ 1 and also the next pipe organ 2, are really the strongest sound that the Casiotone CT201 can produce. It's magical. There's something about it. There's a richness. There's a ethereal feel about it, and it's definitely one of the better sounds. And this is a very nice church organ sound with the CT-S300. It doesn't have the character this one has. It's a sustain on though. And I can imagine with a bit of reverb and chorus or something, or with a vibrato switched on, that would sound really nice. That was a really vintage sounding but magical Casiotone CT201. I really like that sound a lot. And I also like this sound, but it's much more generic. Tone number 20 on the CT-S201 is pipe organ 2. And this is a very, very nice sound. I do like this. It's one of my favorites. And we're going to play it with tone number 60 on the CT-S300, which is a reed organ. as a little aside, I haven't used the vibrato in any of the tones because I wanted to keep them kind of pure. But this tone, this pipe organ 2, sounds really nice with vibrato. So I'm going to turn the vibrato on. As I said, that was played with a bit of vibrato because that really added to that particular tone, that pipe organ 2 tone. I'm going to turn it off now. We'll try some sustain. That, to me, that tone number 19, no, tone number 20, pipe organ 2, it's a really, really nice sound, and it's one of my favorites on the CT201. It's kind of magical. I don't know how to really describe it, but there's something to it. There's a sparkle and warmth, and it's ethereal even. And I couldn't find the exact tone on the CT-S300, and this is a reed organ, and it's a very good representation, reproduction of a reed organ. But it doesn't have the magic that that tone had, and that's something really special in the CT201 there. Tone number 21 is a trombone. Well, it's actually a viola if the tone switches in position 1, but according to the Casiotone manual, if you put it to position 2, it becomes a trombone. On the CT-S300, tone 124 is a trombone. The CT201 did a pretty good job of a trombone sound. I was quite surprised at that. It's quite thick and rich, but it doesn't have the pop, which you get with a brass instrument when you blow through the mouthpiece with pursed lips. So this has pop, pop, pop. But tonally, it's close. It's close to a trombone. And it's very rich. It's a nice sound. Definitely a good sound. One of the better sounds on the CT201. And obviously the CT-S300 is much more realistic. But again, the CT201 has its own character. but it adds to the sound, and I think that's definitely a plus point. Number 22 with the CT201 is a cello. With the CT-S300 is tone number 92. The CT201 does a barely passable reproduction of a cello. It just doesn't have the sound, the attack, the dragging of the bow. I wouldn't expect a 1980 keyboard, home keyboard, to have that sort of sound. Whereas obviously the CT-S300 does a very good job. The sound actually changes as well. It seems down the bottom. You can really feel there's as if it's playing a different, lower, thicker string down here compared with up here, and the drawing of the bow. And as always, the CT201, it's the CT201 cello sound. It doesn't sound like any other cello other than the CT201 cello. It has its own sound. This is much more faithful in reproducing the sound of a cello. But as always, that's still usable. Just don't expect to convince someone it's a cello. Tone 23 with the CT201 is brass, and tone 129, the CT-S300, is also brass. CT201 has, it's sort of passable, it's usable. It sounds better at the bottom end. Less so at the top. That's more weedy, almost like a violin. Just about get away with it. Doesn't have that pop, whereas the CT-S300 does. So if you want your unique CT201 brass sound, which you won't find anywhere else, anywhere in the world, then that will give you something unique. If you want something more realistic, you need a CT-S300 to do a good brass section. Tone 24 on the CT201 is called Wood 1, and it's part of the woodwind family, I believe. The closest I could find on the CT-S300 is tone 159, the recorder. CT-S300 definitely sound much more realistic. Did a nice sound from the 201 though. Tone 26 on the CT201 is the flute, and on the CT-S300, 157 is the pure flute, tone 157. CT-S300 is more realistic for the flute. Still a nice sound on the 201. Number 28 on the CT201 is the violin. On the CT-S300, number 89 is the violin. CT-S300, still the more realistic sound of a violin. 201's not too far away from a violin, sort of. Very synthetic violin maybe, but not a real one. This one is more accurate. Tone 29 on the CT201 is the wah-wah, a kind of vocal effect, wah effect, sort of synthetic. On the CT-S300, the closest I could find to it was tone 114, which is choir R's. Clearly, the CT-S300 sounds much more like a choir of vocal voices. That sounds much more synthetic, the CT201. It's usable, but it's not really passable as a vocal sound. And that brings us to the end of this Casiotone CT201 and CT-S300 tone comparison video. As mentioned, this video is not a competition, and there are no winners or losers. It was simply a curious look at how the sound of these two Casiotones come across with 4 decades of technology between them. Obviously, the CT-S300 is a far more powerful keyboard than the CT201, and its tones are very realistic in portraying the instruments they describe. You could easily use the CT-S300 as a sole sound source in a studio to cover all those bread and butter sounds likely needed in most general compositions. With the exception of more synth-based sounds, it does have a selection of synth-style tones, but it's purely a preset keyboard. Meanwhile, the CT201 is a far more limited keyboard with only 29 preset tones, compared with the 400 in the Casiotone CT-S300. And most of the CT201's tones aren't very realistic or convincing. However, we do need to bear in mind that this keyboard was released in 1980, and at the time, a home keyboard in its target market sector with 29 preset tones was quite impressive. The closest competitor back then was likely one of the Yamaha PS Portasound models, as both Casio and Yamaha were pretty much pioneers of the affordable home keyboard. And also bear in mind in 1980, this era predated consumer accessible digital synths, and we were still in the era of analog synthesizers that in all respects, most of them weren't very good at replicating traditional instruments either. Ironically, it's this non-realism that made those synthesizers so special, because in trying to reproduce traditional instrument sounds, they ended up creating their own unique sonic flavors and tonal characters. And the same applies here to the CT201. For its time, it was quite revelatory in offering the sounds it did, and by using Casio's consonant vowel part digital and part analog synthesis method, in trying to reproduce those traditional instruments, they created a sound that is uniquely Casiotone. I'll be honest in that when I first got this CT201, I felt that many of its tones were rather samey and it didn't offer much. But when I spent more time with them, I found a keyboard with a unique character and a warm, grungy and gritty sound all of its own. And I hope that during the demonstrations, you will also agree that some of its tones are really quite special and would be hard to find anywhere else. For sure, you wouldn't be able to get away with using it as a sole sound source in a studio, but for adding a unique and distinctive vintage tone to a composition, it has quite a lot to offer. Coming back to the CT-S300, it's almost a victim of technology advancement, because by being so accurate with its sound reproduction, it loses any uniqueness that would give it a character of its own. The same applies with most other modern preset keyboards, so this doesn't just apply to these modern Casiotones. What it does mean is that in a mix, you wouldn't be able to tell whether it was a Casiotone CT-S300, a Yamaha, or even a VST making the sound, whereas with the CT201, the sounds are unmistakably and uniquely its own. There you have it, two very different Casiotones, separated by 4 decades, and both having a lot to offer, but in very different ways. If you need a good and large selection of realistic tones from one keyboard, then the CT-S300 will give you that. If you want a keyboard that has some very unique, vintage, distinctive tones that you won't find anywhere else, other than maybe another Casiotone, then the CT201 is the one to get. And that's it for this video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do consider subscribing. Oh, and how on earth am I going to get out of this weird galaxy in this parallel universe? Okay, well, maybe if the magic words and the magic melody brought me here, maybe they'll take me back. Let's give it a shot. Casio Chaos Theory. Phew, luckily, that did the trick and brought me back. Though I really should change the batteries in this because goodness knows where it'll end up taking me next time. Oh, and remember, keep it Casio. Tone.